Hello, Lawrence Romanowski from Porsche Center, Calgary, and this is part 2 of a video description of our 1993 Porsche 928 GTS. In part 1, we talked about what a 928 GTS is, the 350 horsepower, the last of the 928 model range from 1978 to 1995, one of 2,800 cars. About 60% of them are automatic, which this one is. And then some of the history in Japan, and then it went to Vancouver, Edmonton, and then Calgary. And then we take up the story from when the guy presented me this car a couple of years ago, and I bought the car. Okay, so of course the first thing I did with the 928 is I looked at all the maintenance records, and I saw that it had a maintenance history, and that it had regular maintenance, regular oil changes. There was a compression test in there, accident damage, and so forth. I looked it up in our Porsche information computer, and found out that the build date was 1992. That's important because cars going to the US need to be 25 years old if it doesn't have a DOT sticker, and cars from Japan don't have a DOT sticker. So just be clear on that. This car was sold in North America. It was a catalyzed car, so it's a one world engine at that point. But by virtue of the car going to Japan and being a Japan domestic car, it didn't have the DOT sticker on it, because only cars sold into North America would have that. And if a car doesn't have the DOT sticker, even though it's identical to one that was sold in North America at that time, it needs to be 25 years old to get it into the US. Okay? Canada's a little bit different. Cars can come in from Japan at 15 years old, but for the US it needs to be 25. And the 1992 build date is significant because this car is 25 years old. Okay, so I checked all that. It's slate gray with a full black interior, and there's nothing exceptional with the build. There weren't too many options on a 928 GTS. And I got it into the shop and we did the inspection on the car, and there was nothing out of the ordinary with it, just the usual old car leaks and so on. Rear main seal, oil pans leaking, valve covers are leaking, the outer CV boots are cracking, the tires are old, some missing trim pieces, signal canceling isn't working, whatever. So nothing that would be alarming on the car. Normally on these cars you go in and you do the water pump and timing belt every 5 years, just a matter of routine maintenance. And so I bought the car and I thought, okay, well it's a decent example. It doesn't have any, I paint metered the car, and there was only one part that I was unhappy with, that $2,000 collision that was done in Vancouver. So I wanted to redo that, and then I figured, well, same as any 25-year-old car, you know, we address all the leaks in the engine, timing belt, water pump, tires, you know, and I figured we'd have about a $10,000 to $15,000 reconditioning bill on the car, which was reasonable with everything I had so far. Well, the reconditioning on this bill was $75,000, so it was I don't know, there's no easy way to put this. We're going to lose a lot of money on this car. Anyway, so here's what happened. We went through it and started out doing all the usual things, fixing the leaks and stuff. But what happened with it is that when we went into it, we just found things that we weren't happy with, and one thing led to another, etc., etc. So the valve covers on these are magnesium, and the coating flakes off. It happens to a lot of the cars. And I wanted to freshen that up, and so I wanted to pull the valve covers off and have them powder coated. They're magnesium, and nobody really wants to deal with magnesium, and it's really hard to powder coat it. Anyway, but we got it done. So we pulled that off, and then we were doing the timing chain and the water pump. And when we did the timing chain, we weren't happy with the tensioner, and we looked at the gears on the timing chain wheels, and they had a little bit of wear on them. And you don't want your timing chain to slip, and it's possible if you don't have square teeth cut in the gears, it is possible. And so I wanted those replaced, And then we got into it a little bit more, and like I said, the tensioner we wanted to replace, we replaced the water pump. Well, none of these parts are cheap, by the way. On a 928, you know, a gear is $500 and a tensioner is $1,800, and it really adds up quickly. But I felt that, you know, we need to stand behind the car, and I wasn't going to get too concerned about what the bill was going to be. I was more concerned about just getting it right, and I didn't want to go. Sometimes what happens is you're so concerned about making money or losing money on a car that you shortchange these jobs and then leave things that you really ought to have changed, and then find out that, you know, there's some catastrophic failure later because you didn't do the proper work on the car. I was determined that, you know, I'd take my lumps on it, whatever it was, but I wasn't going to skimp on the car. So we replaced all that stuff. And then when we pulled the valve covers off, we looked at the cams, and, you know, there's a little bit of scoring on the lobes of the cams. And so we sent those out. There's not too many places that can refinish those and give them the same heat treating and so on and hardness as they were originally. But there was a place in the States that we found that was well known for that, and we sent it there. But of course there was a whole, the followers needed to be replaced, etc. So that was a big job. Then we got the whole thing together, and this is where it gets particularly ugly. Is we got the whole thing together, and then the crank was tight. In other words, the crankshaft wasn't spinning freely, and it was a mystery to us because it didn't appear that way when we bought the car, and there was no records of it in the past. But when we started to spin the crank, it did not spin freely. Further investigation revealed that further investigation revealed to us a known problem with 928 S4s and GTSs. A known problem to people who are experts in the car, but to be frank, at that time, we didn't really look for it. And that is something that's called the crank walking or moving. And what happens is that because you've got this rear transaxle and this torque tube with a drive shaft in it, and then on one end a flex plate, there's adjustments on either end of this torque tube that control well, obviously the distance between the drive shaft and the rear transaxle and engine. And if left unchecked for reasons I don't actually fully understand, there can be significant pressure pushed on this drive shaft into the flex plate on the back of the engine that can push the crankshaft and bearings into the crankcase. This isn't good. What we found is that this car did have that problem, whether caused by us somehow or it was a condition before, I don't know. You know, maybe the guy knew about it when he sold it to us and didn't tell us, or maybe it happened on its own. I can't answer that. I don't think he knew about it. But whatever, when we looked at it, we found that the crankshaft had scored and the main bearings were destroyed. So that meant that we had to take the bottom of the engine off, and we had to take the engine almost entirely apart, and there's nobody who we felt that can refinish a crankshaft on a 928 GTS, and the crankshaft on a 928 GTS is an 8-bearing crankshaft. It's unique to this particular model, and there was nothing else we could do about it, we felt, reliably, except buy a new crankshaft for $9,000. So we bought a new crankshaft for $9,000 and new bearings and tore the engine apart, and really, when we put it back together, there was very little of this engine that we hadn't either replaced the parts of, or replaced the gaskets on, or replaced entirely. And I have a bill, which does include things like tires and the major tune-up, etc., of $59,629 for all of this work. And basically, 50 of that is the engine. So this is how you have a bad day reconditioning a 928 GTS when you have an unexpected $50,000 bill, which we have on this car. And we're not done yet, because there's a bunch of other things we need to do. The actuator for the rear hatch was broken, the sunroof needed a bit of work. I wasn't happy with the goofy aftermarket stereo that was in the car, so we ripped that out and we replaced it with a Porsche Classic head unit. And we sorted out, you know, a multitude of other sort of minor odds and ends, and by the time we were done, You know, I bought this car for $40,000, which seemed like a good price for a GTS. I anticipated that I'd spend 10 or 15 on it, and figured, you know, I'd sell the car for 60 grand or something like that and make a modest profit. What's actually happened is I bought it for 40, spent 75 on it. We're into it for $115,000, and we have the car for sale for 80. You know, it's basically a $35,000 loss on this car. Anyway, that's too bad for us. Thankfully, the air-cooled market rose fast, and we did make some good profits on some other cars, so I still have a job. But that does leave us with this car, which has an extremely hefty maintenance bill on it, and for all intents and purposes, a rebuilt engine. And somebody's going to get the benefit of our $50,000 misfortune, because they're going to get a 928 GTS with really a fresh engine on it, and it's a great car. So anyway, that's what happened with this car. It's to sum up, it's not a concourse car, it's a driver. There's still the odd paint imperfection on the car. The interior's in very nice shape, but you know, there's the odd thing that's not perfect. It's 110,000 kilometers on the car as it stands right now. So, but it's a great driver, and I've made sure that it's all right. And I've put maybe 500 or 600 kilometers on the car since it was done, just to make sure there's no other problems that have come up, and I have confidence in the car. And that's why we've had it for 2 years. The last 6 months or so, I've just been driving it when I get a chance. It's no chore, because I like 928s, but just to make sure the car is okay. So again, a 928 is complicated. Servicing the car is not cheap. You can have a very bad day with a 928, as we did. But the virtues of the car, you know, the design's still fresh. You know, it's still hard to date the car in terms of the design. The composure of the car and the road holding of the car is really excellent. The torque of the engine, 370 pound-feet of torque, 350 horsepower, 170 mile-an-hour car. So it's a vintage car with modern performance, with what I think is a really interesting, you know, I think it's a really interesting piece of industrial design, very unique, and this is the collectible one to have. So, with all that, if you'd like to talk to us about this car, or talk to me about the car, I'd be happy to go through it, show you the invoices. You can talk to our tech who did the work. We can go through everything that was done. You can have an extended test drive on the car. We can do all that due diligence with you. It's a great learning experience for us, and a very costly one, but somebody will benefit from this. And as an organization, I think we have benefited from it, because now we know a lot more about 928 than we started. It was just awfully expensive. With that, Lawrence Romanowski from Porsche Center, Calgary, thank you for viewing, and we'll go on to our next classic car.